I'm actually writing a book about storytelling in film, and I've become fascinated by the components that go into telling a story, whether it's with friends or whether it's an anonymous audience in a cinema or whatever. So the kind of chemical components of a story fascinate me. And I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to wrap it around some other things, because I've actually told the story before. But it's worth retelling. And it concerns a journey I made in 1977 in May with the People Show Experimental Theatre Group. But before I get to that, I would like to just give you some background and the various components here that are very important to my story, because stories are all about detail, let's face it. So, does anybody know what this is? It's a flugelhorn. It's not a trumpet, it's a flugelhorn. And I had started off as a trumpet player when I was 11, obsessed with Louis Armstrong, and then I discovered Miles Davis, and he had switched from trumpet to flugelhorn. I'd heard sketches of Spain and Porgy and Bess, and I thought, I want one of those. And for my 21st birthday, my godfather, who was also my uncle, his name was Brian Figgis. He's the father of Susie Figgis, the casting director. And he and my father didn't get on well at all. He was the elder brother. They grew up in colonial Kenya, and I sort of only got to know him when I was a little bit older. And he was my godfather, and so when I was 21, he said, "Oh, well, I ought to buy you something." And I said, "I'd like a flugelhorn." And so Brian bought me the flugelhorn. It was £21 from Bill Lewington in just off Cambridge Circus. It's basically the same as a trumpet, but it was actually invented by Mr. Sachs, Herr Sachs, who also invented the saxophone, and originally a marching band instrument. It's got a mellow sound. I'll give you a little blast. It won't be like Miles, but it'll an approximate, nice acoustic. Get the idea. And so I got this when I was 21, and it stayed with me. I've got another one now, and I don't play this one anymore. So just for this particular evening, I got it out of the old box, and I oiled the valves, and it's still quite a nice instrument. It's made by Courtois, French manufacturer, very good if you're interested. They're still around. Anyway, I'll come back to that. In May 1977, I was touring with the People Show, who were a kind of avant-garde performance art group. And when I say performance art, I don't mean performance art like now, like polite, sitting in front of a sort of nice middle-class audience and watching some bullshit. This was confrontational performance theatre where people got broken bones and people tried to have sex with you that you didn't know, and invariably you had to be naked at some point. So it's very different from what we call immersive theatre, which is what we have now. Anyway, so we were on tour at the Nancy Theatre Festival. Nancy is a very, very nice town, famous for its grey wine. At that time, there was a kind of a sort of cultural kind of revolt going on. Jacques Lang was the head of the Nancy Festival, and the natives, the theatre people, were very restless. And there was all kinds of like demonstrations. But despite that, the food was fantastic. And, you know, it's a very bourgeois place. And really, the wine, the grey wine, the food, fantastic. When we finished that, our next stop was Warsaw. And this proved to be a bit of a cultural shock, as we got on somebody said, buy food to take with you. So we bought a lot of cheese and wine and stuff. We got on a train, very long train journey to Warsaw. And as night fell and it got dark and we were huddled in our carriage, an elderly German man came in and asked if we were English. And I said yes. And he was obviously very drunk. And he saw our food and he said, basically said, in the last war, I was a bomber pilot. And I went, oh, really? And he said, yeah. He said, Liverpool. Yeah, like this. So I thought, I'll engage. And I said, in die letzte Krieg, because I did German a little bit. He said, mein Vater war also in RAF, fighter pilot, Hurricanes. And he went, ach so. And I went, yeah, Messerschmitts. And we had this dialogue, and it was kind of, then he left. Anyway, when we got to, I'm just giving you details, basically. So when we got to Warsaw, after really a long time, maybe 3-4 days, I don't know how long it was a long time on that train. And it just got colder and more miserable. There was no food on the train. We finished our cheese. And then we were met at the station by these young students who had organized a little tour, and they picked us up and said, we've got the transport, and and it was a cattle truck, basically. And we got in the back, and they drove us to a camp just outside Warsaw, and with sort of long huts and everything, so segregated, and outside showers, and we thought, wow, okay, experience. And on the first night, by now we were very, very hungry and said, could we go for something to eat? And they said, sure, we're going to take you to the best place in town. We went there, and it was, in fact, a kind of student place, and we ordered spaghetti bolognese because that was all on the menu. And we waited about 2 hours, and when it came, it was literally this size. It's sort of like a 4-mouthful bowl, which we ate very, very quickly and said, can we have some more? And they looked horrified and said, no, you're only allowed one portion. And that's kind of how it proceeded from then on in. And you'd walk down the main street, and their equivalent of Selfridges would have that kind of bendy glass in the window, and it would just be cans of soup, sort of in a kind of triangle, as the main window display. Bars were also interesting. You'd go in and order a beer, and then you'd go and order another beer, and they'd say, we've just run out. And then you'd wait, and then somebody would run into the bar and say something in Polish, and you'd follow them to another bar that had beer. And that's how you drank, except the best place to drink was on a train, we discovered, because they always had alcohol. So the trains were full of alcoholics. I think we'd just got on the train to drink. And we'd started our tour like this, and it was a kind of shock. There was no food. There were no lighting. Lighting was so basic, and it wasn't what we were expecting. And we were very enamored of Polish avant-garde theatre, Cantor and Shiner and people like this, but the conditions there were just grim. And with each gig that passed, it got worse and worse and worse until eventually we arrived in Krakow, by which time, after, let's say, 10 days of this, we were kind of shagged out and miserable. And so they met us at the station, and then we got into the truck. And then they drove us to our accommodation. We were going to be there for 3 days. It basically was 4 miserable apartments, and there were positions on the floor with sleeping bags where that was our accommodation. And we basically, I feel ashamed to say it, but we'd had enough by then, And so we had a little conference on the kind of platform and said, listen, I think we should just say, let's pack it in. So I was designated to say, look, we're really sorry. I think you're lovely people and everything, but we've decided to pack it in and just go back home. And so they went into another huddle, and then they came back and they said, well, we've got a second plan, a plan B, come with us. So we got back in the truck, and they drove us to the Grand Hotel. And I thought, wow, this is kind of plan B I like, It was the most luxurious hotel in Krakow. And we were booked in, single rooms, and help yourself in the restaurant. And I thought, that's quite a jump, But there was something very strange going on in the town. There was no communication. You couldn't buy a newspaper. You couldn't make a phone call. And then we discovered later on that, in fact, the police had just killed a student. And there was a kind of big lockdown going on. And this was 1977. In the bar that night, I noticed a very beautiful blonde woman who kind of looked at me and raised one eyebrow. She had kind of curled hair, not curly hair, and bell-bottom trousers. I know this because I looked it up in my notes yesterday. And then later on, I saw her going upstairs with 5 very fat businessmen and a crate of beer. And so I thought, okay, I guess this is the scene here. The next day was a day off, so I went to Auschwitz on my day off and joined a Japanese tourist group as we went round the camp. I had no idea what they were saying until we went down some stairs. And it got darker and darker and darker, and I suddenly thought, holy fuck, we're in the showers, I got back to Krakow and met the rest of the group, and they said, how was it? And I discovered I couldn't speak. Literally for about 2 hours, I couldn't make a sound with my voice. That night in the bar, we met a very handsome, charismatic young man who started talking to us because we were speaking English, and he turned out to be a double bass player, a jazz musician, and he said, what do you do? And I said, we're doing this show. And And I suddenly thought, wow, we could collaborate, because in the show I played a DJ, but at the very, very end of the show I used to come down onto the stage and play trumpet, flugelhorn. And I said, it's very simple, it's a kind of blues tango, it's in the key of F minor, just 3 chords, and you'll pick it up straight away. There's a guitar backing track, it'd be lovely to have acoustic bass. And he said, I'll do it. So I said, well, just come, you know, you're gonna have to wait for the entire show, and then at the end I do this number, but it'll be lovely. And he said, fine, I'm happy, so we did it. Turned up at the venue, which was like Wembley Stadium, and we discovered we were sharing the bill with the Russian Red Army Ensemble, which was odd. And they'd bust in thousands of school children to see the Red Army Ensemble and the People Show. And I remember sharing the dressing room and thinking, this is strange, you know, and there was these divas, and, you know, I was just like, it's kind of wonderful, but at the same time, odd. And then it was time for us to go on. Now, I have to tell you some more details. So part of the show that I'm talking about with the double bass player was at the end when I was DJing in my booth, and then I came down, and there was a circle of wine glasses. It was a show about Tennessee Williams and his crazy sister, Rose. And she was in the middle, played by a man, and in each wine glass there was a smoking cigarette and a red rose. And I had a very dramatic moment. I used to come on and smash a wine glass or two with my foot, and then I would stand in the middle of the circle, and I would hold out my arm like this, and then this would happen. So, yeah. This was a vital prop for the People Show, and this also, string. So we'd tie on a piece of string, and then loop it round the lighting grid, and it would go off to the side, and then an assistant on my cue would lower down my flugelhorn, and I had it down so I knew if I stood there and did this, the flugelhorn would descend into my hand. And the assistant that we had was a young Polish girl who was very, very depressed, and but spoke English, but she was, I just remember her as being depressed the whole time. And of course, this was a challenge technically, because the ceiling was about 3 miles high, so we had to get a very, very big bowl of string. And if anyone knows anything about, you know, physics and the law of kind of, you know, friction and so on, you know, the bigger the pull, the more friction and the weight coefficient, it gets trickier. You know, it'd be perfect in here, but we weren't here. So anyway, we got to the end. My poor Polish bass player was standing there, looking somewhat bemused by the show, which was a little odd anyway. And anyway, the bit came, and I stepped in, the light came on, I smashed the wine glass, and I just stood in the light. Now, there were thousands of school children sitting in the audience, just looking up, I remember that. And I did this, at which point the depressed assistant obviously tried to kind of let it go, but there was too much friction on the string, so she gave it a jolly good old tug, at which point, and then let go of the string. And it came down from the top of the roof, and it basically hit me on the head and rendered me unconscious on the stage. And so I remember the moment of being hit by the flugelhorn and lying there and then coming to. And the first thing I remember, because of the eye line, was the kids in the front row just kind of going, what the fuck? Kind of like, it's interesting, you know. And then I thought, you know, the sort of performer in you kind of goes, okay, rescue the moment. Okay, it's been a fuck up, but, you know, the show must go on. So, and also being mildly interested in physics and all the rest of it, I saw that, in fact, what was happening now was that the flugelhorn was on this 1 minute, it's perfect timing, monumental loop across the stage, rather like a sort of NASA kind of, you know, equation, you know, kind of too high up there, but it does pass over my head, you know, every 3 seconds or so. And I'm on the floor. So I thought, okay, I'll just time it. So I went back into performance mode, like this was meant to happen. And I watched it coming down, I watched it going up again, okay, next time. So as I stood up, the depressed assistant realized her mistake, and she kind of yanked it up again. And so as I reached for it, it kind of went out of my reach again. At which point, it was like Saturday Night Fever moment, you know, like I did really meant this to happen. And then I kind of looked at her with one of those looks like, don't fucking do that to me, give me my flugelhorn back. And so she lowered it down again. As it came down, I took it off the butcher's hook, and I put it to my lips. I looked at the double bass player and I said, "This is our moment at last." And I put it to my lips, and I noticed that the mouthpiece was missing because when it hit me on the head the first time, it had dropped out. And there's nothing you can do with the flugelhorn without a mouthpiece, except get the fuck off. Thank you.